It's 2 hours to Fort Worth, isn't it? Are you on the other side
Of?
Fort Worth?
No.
So you're on this side? Well, then maybe it's not. Maybe it's
Well, except for the traffic through Dallas is awful.
well, yes, that is just
It's just 2.5 hours like it was today.
yeah. But tomorrow, probably better.
It should be. Well, we shall see.
Yeah, he's got. I already posted that with you, see. Yeah, I know. But, and you know we're not throwing down about it. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't introduce you.
And you live where?
In Fort Worth.
Okay, my son and his wife live in Weathersburg.
Way on the other side. Yeah.
It is on the other side, yeah. Yeah, they drive to Castleberry to go to church. And
You get your pictures off
it's
your
a long
phone.
drive.
No. I do get my picture off my phone, but I'm just making sure that we're live to the world.
Yes, I have to work Friday. I do. Yeah, but
How do you get that?
and you know
What's that?
Pitch
it's one of those.
No, I have a little app. It's like a pitch pipe app, and you hit the
I've got
key
about
or
half
sharp
my
or
staff
flat that
to
you
be
want,
out
and it's
there.
good.
So
Yeah,
the boss
it's
can
neat.
always be out
Real
there.
simple. I have one for tuning string instruments
But-
too.
Having his
So you
family
vibrate
on
it and you
Saturday,
actually
so
tune
we
it.
We'll be here Saturday.
It's fun and it's real cool. So
And probably
you
Sunday
gotta
night.
tune it there. I actually got a lap part,
But-
so.
Depends
I
on.
have a strange thing in my head when I shake it like that. I shake it one way, it's innate for them.
Are you going to Good Friday?
I'm a big fan.
If that works for you, right?
Yeah.
That's good. You don't have to download the app and get your phone out or anything. So.
Oh, okay. Well,
The only thing is, if I do that, my
we're trying to find
throw
out.
out
real
my
ones
hearing
to
aid,
be
then I
open.
can't hear.
You just have to go off how it feels,
You
right?
might be there for that. Okay. Well, so we can finally talk about you.
There's still time, don't you worry.
So you would put a spy in a minute. Oh, wait. I'm gonna at least start watching it, Bob. I wish I was more optimistic.
Mary and I were just having this conversation, that she wrote the news.
He ought to be real optimistic. Really?
Both sides assume they're gonna lose.
Yeah, it's like,
Pessimist go.
and you know, really, because Texas got a really good team, and we've shown that we can play, but we don't always show up. And yes,
But you with me.
he is going to get conversation, so that's advantage to us. But
They are gonna show up. They're not gonna fail to show up again.
let's hope.
He said, first.
Let's hope not. I have
Feel free
been
to join
there
us
in
if you
games
want.
that didn't mean a thing except so we'll see. But if they don't play any better than they played in the first half against Auburn,
That's Georgia's biggest fan.
it'll be a long, long day. Well, they spot him. What did he spot him? 21 points. You can't spot somebody 21 points.
Well, you can't do that.
Good evening, good to be with y'all. So we are in 1 Corinthians. Too late now if you're in the wrong class. Now hopefully everyone's been getting a lot of good from this. I'm going to start with prayer, we'll do a little review, and then we will continue in chapter 9. Thank you, kind and merciful Father, for the blessings you give, your great patience with us, continuing to work with us and train us in your ways. Thank you for your love, Father, your deliverance from sin, for hope in your Son. Pray your blessings on us all, Father, for those of us traveling, for those who suffer from loss of loved ones and find this to be a lonely time of year. Pray your comfort and help on all that will be there for each other and be a strength for each other. Bless us and keep us from the evil one. Guide us in our studies and all your teachers, Father. Be with Shane on the road and help him to return to us safely and all those traveling. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so hello. Just getting started here. So, we covered quite a bit of ground Sunday. Maybe we finished up chapter 8, got into chapter 9. So as a little review, 1 Corinthians, remember, the first 6 chapters, as we call them chapters, Paul is responding to the things they didn't write, or they didn't make it too explicit. The Corinthians, they apparently had a lot of problems. Division being a big theme throughout this book and all the evil that it leads to. And so Paul had to address a lot of things up front. And then by chapter 7, he's like, now concerning the things that you wrote. Chapter 7 was huge exposition on all the many scenarios of marriage. Maybe not all of them, but he covers a lot of different categories there. Then chapter 8 through 10 is its own section. You remember, chapters divisions often bad, not always, and they serve some purpose, but it can be misleading. So chapter 8 through 10, one big section dealing with idolatry. And not just idolatry itself, but the practical applications of what that led to in their society. First half of chapter 8, he laid a little groundwork, like Paul likes to do, of theory there. He talked about concerning, we have knowledge that there's only one God, kind of uses that Jewish formula for one God, or as Gordon Fee would call it, that Jewish formula, I believe. But as he does multiple times in his writings, that formula for that one God, that unity there. One God the Father, verse 6, from whom are all things, and we exist for him. And one Lord Jesus Christ, by whom are all things, and we exist through him. So he lays that groundwork that there's no such thing as an idol. Yes, Moses talks about them worshiping demons, but maybe he's just referring to demonic activity. Regardless, there's only one true God, and everything else came through him, though some of the creation and all humanity chose to corrupt itself. Then in the second half of chapter 8, he talks about the weakness, the weak brethren. Those who can't understand or can't fully get their conscience away from the idea that going through idolatrous rituals means you're worshiping idols, and that these idols are actually represent real gods and so forth. And so Paul's like, you're more worried about your liberties and what you think you have a right to, and he tries to show them a better way. Here's how you act in love. Here's how you give up your liberties, probably quote unquote liberties there, as we'll see in chapter 10. How you give these things up for the sake of the brethren, and that you stop seeking the pleasures of your own flesh. So he goes through that. Then he gets into chapter 9, which is very easy to think this is a departure, this is a completely different study, but that's simply not true. It is in the whole context here of liberties and rights, so to speak, and freedoms and idolatry. And it's a good segue where Paul again defends his ministry, and yet at the same time shows how he has been the example for giving up liberties and freedoms for the sake of those who need it. And the Corinthians were those who needed it, and they still spat in his face for doing it, apparently. From reading between the lines a little bit. And let me review the first part of that right quick. Chapter 9, that is. So in that, we got to verse something or other. We got to verse 15, apparently, according to my notes. And so, with all this, what do I want to cover? So, verses 3 through 7, Paul again gives them a defense for his ministry. Whereas in chapter 4, he's like, it's a very little thing if you examine me. Here, he's like, now he gives a defense to those who examine him. He talks about the right to eat and drink. Maybe that means financial support in this context, as the NET footnotes. Maybe not. Regardless, he has to defend himself. Do we not have a right to take a believing wife? Whereas in chapter 7, there seemed to be a movement towards celibacy in dealing, maybe because of Paul, maybe because of Jesus, maybe because of their culture, and some of the teachings that taught celibacy there. And so Paul has to defend a lot of what he did, and to show that he has the right to do lots of things that he willingly gave up. And of course, it's thought that maybe, at least by some, that the defense for eating and drinking. Maybe he would eat meat sold in the marketplace. And the Corinthians are like, well, why can you do that? But then you're telling us not to eat at these idols feasts with our family, with our friends. And so Paul has to go through a lot of that, as we'll see in chapter 10. And then in 8 through 14, Paul expands his argument there. He uses the Old Testament law. There's probably some Jews in the audience, though mainly pagans, from what it seems. So he uses the Old Testament law, talks about muzzling the ox, as we see in 1 Timothy 5, a metaphor for receiving financial payment. And Paul's like, if we sowed spiritual things, verse 11, is it too much if we in you? Is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others show the right, do we not more? Maybe referring to their itinerant teachers, maybe referring to other disciples who had taught there, maybe did receive money. It doesn't exactly specify there. Paul's like, we had a right to all of these things. But even those in the temple, verse 13, they share at the altar there. So the Lord directed those who proclaim the gospel to get their living. So also the Lord directed those who proclaim the gospel to get their living from the gospel. And that brought us up to where we were. And in his defense, the things that he's been outlining, and some of the different analogies, metaphors, whatever, stories, whatever you call it, that he's been bringing up to show that he definitely had a right with God as witness, with God's authority, to do these things. So, that is our review from last time. Any thoughts, questions, comments? I know it was quick, but of course, we had to make progress too. Okay. 15 through 18. Would someone please read that?
But I have used none of these things, and I am not writing these things so that it will be done so in my case. For it would be better for me to die than to have any man make my boast an empty one. For if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for I am under compulsion. For woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this voluntarily, I have a reward. But if against my will, I have a stewardship entrusted to me. What then is my reward? That, when I preach the gospel, I may offer the gospel without charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel.
Thank you. Okay, so Paul getting, I guess, kind of personal here in talking again about why he does these things. So he talks about the nature of his ministry, and he seems, this can be a little confusing. I just had trouble interpreting this. And I know I mention his name a lot, but he's one of the main commentators. I guess the main commentator I use, besides the Bible class recordings. So Gordon Fee, he talks about that Paul had a divine appointment. And that's true. We see that in Acts 22. Paul speaking, and I said, what shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said to me, get up and go into Damascus, and there you will be told of all that has been appointed for you to do. So Gordon Fee, he takes the case strongly that Paul had a divine appointment and he had no reward. It was not voluntary. That basically God's like, you're going to preach the gospel. Now, as you read these verses, I see how you can come away with a different view. That maybe Paul did some of it voluntarily or to some degree. And so while there apparently was a divine appointment for him to preach the gospel and minister, then maybe, of course, as we just saw, he wasn't compelled to do all of it to the degree he did. Because what did he say? Don't we have a right to take a break from working, to take a sister, his wife, and all of those things? So what do y'all think? I know I talked a lot, but in that section, how have you taken these verses? Did you take it as to be Paul is acting voluntarily, or he has a stewardship?
Well, he says he has a stewardship.
That's true. So he definitely has a stewardship.
Oh. I wonder, maybe if he had not done so, it'd be like Jonah.
Yeah.
That everything would work against him and propel him toward what he should be doing.
Yeah. That's a great analogy there. Jonah didn't have a choice. He tried to not have a choice.
Yeah.
Or to have a choice. So, great point. So, a couple things about this. Yeah, so it seems that he obviously did have a stewardship, maybe to some degree voluntary, but he was still required by God, it would seem, to go and preach the gospel. He makes the point that when Paul says, what then is my reward? He's not saying, I get a reward, what is it? He's saying, what is it? There's nothing there, essentially. And then Paul makes the point that his reward is to preach for free. So he takes the right he does have in the gospel to get paid as God directed and gave that up. So that if Paul had any reward, it was self-denial for the sake of the Corinthians, for the sake of others. And so in a huge ironic twist, Paul takes what should have been, a blessing for his hard work and self-sacrifice and all the torment he went through, and gave it up for the sake of those who should have known better, should have been more understanding and giving, as Paul outlines through this chapter. Also in these verses, so he notes that boasting is a particularly Pauline or Paul-related word in the New Testament. It's often used negatively, even in this book. But when he uses it in a positive way, Paul boasts or glories in that which often goes against human wisdom, like Christ's crucifixions, weaknesses, and sufferings. So here, what's Paul boasting about? Like verse 15, be better for me to die than have any man make my boast an empty one.
That he's not using the rights that he did have, like you were just saying,
Yeah.
the right to accept payment.
His boast was not, look how much I'm making, it's look what I'm giving up for the Lord. Not boasting in a vain way, obviously, but his boast in the sense of, here's a good thing I'm doing. And it, in a sense, blew up in his face. I mean, obviously he did the right thing, but there's some people who didn't appreciate that. So, and if Paul was to have a reward rather for his ministry, what that would be, we don't know. Like something spiritual, something physical. But regardless, it was a stewardship. He took that on, served honorably, and in the end was laid up for him the crown of life because he was faithful. Okay. So sometimes we'll get little complicated verses here. Hopefully that helps illuminate that. Someone please read 19 through 23.
For though I am free from all people, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I may gain more. To the Jews I became as a Jew, so that I might gain Jews. To those who are under the law, I became as one under the law, though not being under the law myself, so that I might gain those who are under the law. To those who are without the law, I became as one without the law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, so that I might gain those who are without the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might gain the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that I may by all means save some. I do all things for the sake of the gospel, so that I may become a fellow partaker of it.
Thank you. So he uses contrast, ironies, and so forth to show his self-denying service to the Lord. But don't remove this from its context, right? He's continuing the defense of his ministry, and just showing, again, to a degree, what liberties he's giving up. Though, in all this, please understand, Paul is not saying he adapted his teaching or, twisted his teaching for the sake of his audience. He might have related to them on different ways, but he didn't change his message. The gospel message stayed the same. It was just how Paul related to them, how there was understanding there, that he met these people halfway, so to speak. Verse 19, he's free from all men. In a few ways, Paul's teachings, his appointment to his ministry came from where?
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, Jesus directly, isn't it? The Holy Spirit through inspiration and so forth. So it came from that. He's free from all men. Also, he didn't accept money from them. There was no temptation towards allegiance for patronage. It's just, he did what needed to be done. He did not compromise the mission. And with that in mind, he was free to these in verses 20 through 22, but he still related to them and met them and helped them where they were. Of course, for these, it's pretty easy, I think. Paul was well acquainted with the Jewish lifestyle in verse 20. The law itself, of course, though he himself was not under the Jewish law anymore, but he definitely could relate and understood it there. So even with the pagans there, he knew what it was like to not be justified by law, to be free from that Jewish law, but he still had the law of Christ, the commandments of Christ, the law of faith perhaps, and how we live by faith and obedience, and then God freely bestows that grace to us. So he could relate in a lot of ways to different audiences there. Even the weak. Maybe he's talking about the weak in chapter 8. Remember those weak in conscience who were still tended toward idolatry or believe in idolatry. Maybe he's just talking about how in chapter 2 he was with the Corinthians and weakness and fear and trembling. Do you remember when Jesus had to appear to Paul in a vision? Or I don't know if it said a vision, but he had to appear to Paul and say, don't be afraid any longer, but go on teaching. I've got many people in the city. That's Corinth. So Paul understood a lot of these things. He understood the failure to keep the law. Think of chapter 7 of Romans, that back and forth for like the things I do not want to do, I do. And whether Paul's talking about himself or using, a kind of a theoretical person in that discussion, he still would have understood failure and sin as well. Verse 23, I do think do all things for the sake of the gospel, so that I may become a fellow partaker of it. We'll see more of that in just a moment, but even in these things, Paul had his mission. It wasn't just spreading the gospel to others, spreading it to Christ. It was that he might be found faithful by faithfully keeping the word of God there. Nothing earned, but showing himself faithful, and again, that grace freely bestowed. And so in all these things, too, for all the people he reached, for all the people that he helped accommodate himself toward, Paul, sorry, I lost my point. There was always that acute awareness of the gospel itself and how neglect of it was a very serious matter. Okay, yeah, and Feed points out that I want to give him credit because I didn't come up with a bunch of these ideas, so I don't want to just say, yeah, no, Dustin read book tell Dustin things. So he also notes that this section is about how one lives and behaves among those that the person desires to evangelize. Again, it's not about adapting teaching to them. It's about how do you be integrated with that community of potential converts there. 24 through 27, please.
Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty. Thus I fight, not as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified.
Thank you. So, I know I say this a lot. If you learn anything from this class, learn to hate verse and chapter number. I'm kidding. No. Learn the danger thereof, to be aware of them. So, this is not the end of a chapter. This is not anything except words that relate to what was said and what will be said. This is a transitional point. It talks about what Paul's just been discussing, his giving up his liberties, and the things, his efforts for the gospel, and it leads back into that discussion of idolatry. Chapter 10, heavy, maybe the complete thing, with discussion on idolatry and their culture and what he was prohibiting and warning them against. And so this helps to transition from that self-discipline, that focus, that not running without aim, and so forth. So this can help get us back into discussion. Paul took a brief aside. Now he's back to the original topic there. And if you'll see in chapter 10, there's no new section. He often talked about now concerning. You don't see that. It's a continuation. So, who remembers, trivia time for 100 points, who remembers the name of the games, the competitions, athletic, poetic, that were held in that region every 2 years.
It's.
Just being,
Yes, very good. Y'all can share the points. I think Lori's first.
she started.
Yeah, the Isthmian Games. It was Corinth was on the Isthmus. So it occurred every 2 years. Probably what do they say? The second most popular in the area. And so Olympic every 4 years. It's occurred the year before and after. And so just see what he notes here. He doesn't mention poetry, but that's okay. Everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. They do it for a perishable wreath, we for an imperishable. But we imperishable. I run in such a way, it's not without aim. I box in such a way, it's not beating the air, discipline my body. I mean, see how that would relate to them. And of course, we can understand it as well, because we have those things. Except when they add breakdancing and stuff. I'm sure, that counts too, right? Whatever else people do. Flag football coming up in LA in 2028. So yeah, there you go. So yeah, things like that. And they would definitely understand these things. It would relate to them very, very well. And of course, they had their perishable victory wreath, the crown of leaves or whatever. I didn't capture that, but.
Laurel leaves.
What's that?
Laurel
leaves.
Mm-hmm.
They rest on their laurels. Makes sense. Of course, that would perish. And then, ironically, we have one that is imperishable. And so he would use that same phraseology, just like bread of life, water of life, so forth. The things that in this life perish so quick are eternal, or lead to eternity for us. He was not wishy-washy in his teachings. He was very disciplined, he was focused, he was deliberate. What do you think? What did he mean that he buffeted his body? No, it does not buffet his body. So.
He's just trying to get himself in shape.
Well, yeah, how do you think he did that?
Well, you're gonna have to exercise.
Bodily exercise does profit little, right? So, what else could it be referring to? There's perhaps the temptation to go to self-flagellation. Probably, maybe not what's being mentioned here, right? But then, Fee notes that it's, he notes that disqualified is another athletic metaphor. Maybe it means something like the athlete didn't qualify for the event due to failing the test for it. So, another little historical point. And so for buffeting his body, again, Fee notes that Paul voluntarily subjected himself to hardships, such as depriving himself of his rights by toiling and enduring affliction for the sake of the Corinthians. So he wasn't, I don't think it was just that he was like whipping himself as you see in the movies or whatever, but instead that he went into these things, and even in Acts, what did it say? The Holy Spirit told him that he had all these persecutions awaiting him in every city, but he still kept on going in that.
Well, he gave up his rights as a powerful Jewish leader to teach Christians or to teach people about Christ. All the way back to there, he's given up a lot.
Yeah, that's true. And you don't go back from that. You can't do that part way and hey guys, we're cool, right? So no, and so he had to, that would train him, giving up his wealth, voluntarily putting up with all this turmoil and strife and pushback from the Corinthians. Okay, I thought I saw a hand. So.
Yeah, I have a question. It would seem in this context where he's used all of these athletic metaphors that this is just a reference again to what an athlete would do, that is disciplining his body, not eating every pizza that he sees, running for exercise but also for training, and that as such he's bringing his body into subjection. Of course, not in the physical sense any more than the ones up above were, but in a spiritual sense.
Yeah. No,
so you're the Greek guy. So my New King James says, I discipline my body. Now I notice the New International Version says, I strike blows on my body.
Yeah.
That's what buffeted means.
So, yeah, but we say, I buffeted, is that I worked it I endured hardship so I could train. I've ridden my bicycle to the point of exhaustion. So is that word more akin to the blows or to the discipline?
I am opening my software, because when you study Greek, what you learn is you just need the right resources to study Greek. And so I will say the New American Standard footnotes it is literally bruised, but that's, it's often simplistic. These are nuanced things oftentimes. So.
But would it be literally bruised because he is still within a metaphor?
Yeah, I don't think it's literal. No,
Right.
You're right.
So I think we get that it's a metaphor until we get to that verse, and then we want to switch it to being about something else.
It's funny how we do that, isn't it? As soon as we see something that's novel or a little offbeat, we're just immediately veer in that direction.
NET says subdue.
Subdue? Any footnotes on that? Or?
No.
Really?
Young's literal says chastise.
Chastise, okay.
This is one of the largest variety of translations I've heard.
So here's some, from the BDAG dictionary. Hupopiazo. All right, let's see. So one is to blacken an eye, such as give a black eye or strike in the face. Another is to bring someone to submission by constant annoyance, wear down. They kind of did that to him. No, he still held his own. Number 3, and this is the one they say references that verse. They'll often tell you which verse they think goes with which definition. To put under strict discipline, such as punish, treat roughly, torment, so forth. So yeah, you can get a lot of nuance from it there. But yeah, no, Casey, you're right. I think it's still a metaphor. I don't think he was doing that. I don't think he was annoying himself or whatever, punishing, treating roughly. Because he had enough of that when he was stoned and beaten and shipwrecked. And so the self-discipline probably wouldn't help if you're incapacitating yourself for your mission ahead.
The sense I always got from this is that Paul was saying that he obsessively controls his actions and his words and even his thoughts.
Yeah.
Not only when he preaches the gospel, but also in how he conducts himself around the people that he's trying to influence to move towards the Lord. That he's overcautious even sometimes. Not overcautious, but extra cautious about how he is perceived, and willing to remove from himself, which is what would take extreme discipline, remove from himself or how he is perceived anything that would hinder the work of the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
I had a good friend that when he became a Christian, he became a Christian wholeheartedly and wanted to be able to communicate with every person he came across about the good news that he found. But when he came to the gospel, he was the lead singer of a heavy metal band. And he was very proud of his long hair. And what he found a few months into being a Christian was that he would often get blank stares, especially from people with silver hair. So he made a personal decision that if his hair was getting in the way of him being able to communicate about God with others, then he would just get rid of it. As much as it meant to him, he cut that off of himself. And I think I talked to him later about that, as I heard him describe that to 13-year-old boys asking about whether or not it's okay to get an earring. And he very much got that from Paul's writings, and was inspired by the way Paul went about things.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's a good example that applies to what he's talking about here, but to me, I can see how it fits.
I think it's fantastic for him and the example, because it's not a one-time act. You have to deal with any potential regret and looking back and like, do I grow it back out? Now you're constantly under a sense of discipline. So I think that's very good.
And it matches who Paul was even before he became a Christian. I mean, what he did before that was very extreme, even as a form of being a devout Jew.
Yeah.
I mean, he was leading the charge in many ways. He was willing to be out in front and sacrifice his life to go persecute these people that he thought were against what he believed in.
Yeah. And as Lori was saying, he gave all that up. Any chance at prestige and all that. So, true.
Dustin, I'll chase my footnotes here just a minute on that word disqualified. Paul uses that apparently over in 2 Corinthians 13 in another reference, and the notes there seem to indicate that perhaps failed a test is the meaning there.
Interesting. Yeah, disqualify there.
Chapter 13, so.
So you're talking about at the end of 27, that disqualify there?
Yes, but he said, here's what I do. I discipline my body. I bring it into subjection, lest when I preach to others, then I fail the test.
Yeah.
So he makes sure that he's watching for what he does, how he acts, so that he doesn't cause anyone to stumble by the things that he preaches or the things that he does. And by doing that, fails the test, which is, I guess, the way you would say the test of his following what God has told him to do.
Mm-hmm. So, no, very good. And that I did want to talk about that point. So practically speaking, what do y'all think he's referring to? Yes, the failing the test of what God expects and wants, but what does that lead to? What is he getting at?
Well, if he does do that, then he's going to have a situation where people are going to be influenced poorly and will not be brought to the gospel with the same zeal that they might with him doing the things he's supposed to, keeping himself in control, subjecting himself to the rigors of the life that he's been called for.
Yeah. And, it's hard to argue with that, because in context, that really seems to be what he's talking about. It's very easy to jump to, he's lost. And that doesn't seem to be the context. Not that it's not true, but it doesn't seem to be the direct context there. But yeah, then at least in this, he does fail to reach others. I think that you brought it up and you said it very well. I think it also ties, and there is a sense in which it is eschatological. Remember, eschatology, study of the end times, and that word is used to refer to eternity too. So eschatological in the sense that in verse 23, I do all things for the sake of the gospel so that I may become a fellow partaker of it. And I think in that context, you probably can see his soul, because he just finished talking about the souls of these people he was trying to reach. But no, Keith, I think you're right. The disqualification definitely disqualifies him from reaching others and helping them too. A lot of nuance, back and forth, historical references. Okay, that's chapter 9. Who has anything else? Okay, we're chapter 10. Chapter 10. Okay, so. But I discipline my body, it's the end of chapter 9, but I discipline my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified, for I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea. You see that flow? There's a flow there. That for, he's explaining what he just said. So we'll resume the discussion on idolatry, but of course keeping in mind everything we just looked at. Chapter 8 laid the groundwork. It talked about there's no such thing as these false gods. You got to be careful of your brethren who may still be given towards that kind of idolatry and believing those things there. And then whether or not it's a freedom, Paul talks about, of course, chapter 8, denying that oneself that right, supposed right to eat in the idol's temple for the sake of the brethren. Chapter 9, we know he doesn't really switch gears. He talks about giving up these personal liberties, and of course, defending his own gospel and how he gave up his liberties. Of course, I beat that horse a lot. So, what does that lead us to? Chapter 10. What is chapter 10? Paul starts by showing the need, in the first part, for wholehearted allegiance to God. He shows the danger of idolatry in multiple forms. Of course, he goes to the Old Testament a lot with examples we're familiar with, and maybe some of them would be. He then ends by showing that he shows, kind of takes a different turn, talks about freedoms that we can enjoy, that God does permit. And in the middle, he talks about just the need to avoid idolatry and like fellowshipping with idol worshippers in their idolatrous practices and not going through those rituals with them. He talks about two kinds of fellowship, the vertical one between us and deity, be it God or these false gods, and the horizontal one with each other. Think of us around the Lord's table, think of us around the idol's table, the eating in the idol's table. So, someone please read 1 through, let's just do 13. I'll give you the big section.
For I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea. And all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not well pleased, for they were laid low in the wilderness. Now these things happened as examples for us, so that we would not crave evil things as they also craved. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, and stood up to play. Nor let us act immorally, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in one day. Nor let us try the Lord, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the serpents. Nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed that he does not fall. No temptation has overtaken you, but such as is common to man. And God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. But with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure it.
Thank you. Okay. So he makes a comparison. For as pagan as much of the audience must have been, he still uses a lot of the Old Testament. Of course, he was with them 18 months, and he'd written them previously, so it's not like he wouldn't have brought some of that up to them. He starts by this comparison between the Jews of Moses' time and the freedom from the bondage in Egypt, Christians today. And he shows that parallel between that baptism, how they were, in a sense, baptized into Moses, following Moses, the law of Moses. And, of course, by implication, the baptism today. So for anyone who thinks the baptism mentioned in chapter 1 is unimportant, no. Tap them brakes. So he shows that, and of course, the Corinthians, and warns them of the idolatry and the culture in which they were surrounded. Of course, all of this came from the Lord, the miraculous separation of the waters, the pillar of cloud, and all that, the defeating of the Egyptians. And in our baptism today, God extends His grace to us, and so it all, again, comes from Christ for those who are faithful. In the wilderness, verses 3 and 4, the spiritual food, the spiritual drink, it was real food and water, but in what sense was it spiritual?
It came from God directly.
Yeah, it originated from Him. I think the manna was called the bread of angels in one of the Psalms, and whatever that means. It's poetic, at least. But yeah, and Christ would talk about that He was the bread of life, or the bread that came down out of heaven, the water of life that springs up to eternal life. I think that's in John 4. So they represent what? God's sustainment of His people, His mindfulness of His people, His divine providence providing for His people there. In all this, chapter 5, what is Paul's point here? He's like, despite all that, let's go on. Despite being God's special people, despite the fact that they're supposed to be a light of the world, they died because of their sinfulness in the wilderness, their rebellion, the despising the commandments of God. So Paul then goes into an explanation of what this verse means. So verse 5, they're laid low, and then he kind of expands upon that and talks about what's going on. And what's the implication in all of this? He's implying something for the Corinthians. He's like, all this, your idolatry is no different. You get caught up in that. This is going to happen to you as well. And so, not in a physical sense, maybe, much worse in a spiritual sense. They're not immune to falling from grace. And he may never use those words directly, but I think the implication is very heavy in some of these passages there. 4 minutes. 4 minutes of playtime. Would someone please read 6 through 10? Oh, wait, I'm sorry, you read all that. I'm just kidding. I forget, because I have them divided up in little chunks in my notes
Or
here.
maybe I didn't read it good enough.
No, you read very good.
I like that. That's the wrong phrase.
I'm kidding.
I think it's interesting the way he starts in another one of his lists. First, he has people that they were like completely away from the Lord. They sat down to eat and drink, they got up to play.
Yeah.
Then some of them acted immorally, not quite so specific, maybe not quite so bad. And then they tried the Lord, even maybe a little less sinful. And then grumbling.
Yeah.
So he really brings that in from what we think of as flagrant sin to under your breath.
Maybe that first one, I think, is that Moses and the calf that sat down to eat and drink. So yeah, that blatant idolatry and stuff. Yeah, so it's a very manifold look at what the people did. Hint, hint, Corinthians. Mm-hmm. So whether you're leading weak brethren astray, whether you're engaging in these practices, we don't do that. As an aside, it's often, sometimes we'll be like, well, why was God so harsh, quote unquote, in the Old Testament? Why did he kill people like he did sometimes? This says, and I think it's 2 Peter 2 that says, these things happen as examples. And so even in these terrible things, God uses them to try and warn his people. That's why they're recorded. That's why they're left for us as examples there. It's not that God took pleasure in these things, just that something that justice needed to be meted out, justice rather, and of course needed to be communicated through generations. Sorry, let's see what I want to pick from this. So, they sat down to eat and drink, rose up to play. Eating and drinking, don't you love those metaphors that keep using it? And of course, stood up to play, and you can make the strong case that this is the implication of sexual immorality. Think back to chapter 6, and that as well, maybe whether with the idol temple priestesses or whatever. But yeah, eating and drinking, how's that parallel to the Corinthians? Watch what you're doing, watch the culture around you. You have no business with these cultic meals, these meals at idols' temples, and so forth. So, again, brief aside, Paul mentions 23,000. The account, at least one of them, mentions 24,000. So Paul says in one day, maybe that's what's going on there. But regardless, nothing to worry about. So the number doesn't match up exactly. Let's get this finished up for the Bereans. Verse 9, try the Lord. So Paul, he still keeps his point, right? The Corinthians were testing God by pushing back, perhaps, on Paul's prohibition, the Lord's prohibition from eating at the idols' temple, engaging those practices. In the Exodus example, they grumbled against God and Moses. Here it's God and Paul, his apostle. So we can see the parallel there. Test, as it says in verse 9 there, or try the Lord, test the Lord. You won't find it in Numbers 21. You will in Psalm 78, though. So that talks about a similar circumstance, the same circumstance, from one of those events of the wanderings there, or the wilderness travels. And then for verse 10, nor grumble as some of them did, were destroyed by the destroyer. So it may be implying they were grumbling against God and Paul, again the Corinthians that is. And for Numbers, there's two possible passages. They were grumbling against Moses and Aaron after the bad report of the spies, or the rebellion of Korah. So a lot of examples it could be, or examples brought up rather in this passage. If there's nothing else, y'all have a great holiday. Thank you for your comments and readings and time.
Sorry.
Waiting on speed.